A prestigious astronomy professor storms into a fog-shrouded cathedral, his voice echoing through ancient halls as he screams, "God is dead." What happens next sends chills through the entire congregation and changes the town of Mist Harbor forever. This is a story about faith, science, and the mysterious lights that locals call heaven's tears, a phenomenon that no one can explain, until now. Before we begin this extraordinary tale, take a moment to subscribe to our channel for more powerful stories that will leave you speechless. Click that notification bell to never miss our weekly uploads of life-changing moments that defy explanation. Kieran Thorne's footsteps echoed against the cobblestones as he made his way through the perpetual fog of Mist Harbor. His hands trembled, clutching a worn leather briefcase filled with astronomical data, evidence, he believed, that would shatter everything the townsfolk held sacred. The weight of his discovery pressed down on him like a physical burden, much like the fog that seemed to grow thicker with each step toward the Cathedral of the sacred light. The morning bells tolled ominously through the mist, calling the faithful to Sunday service. Each ring sent waves of anger coursing through Kieran's body. Just 3 weeks ago, he had stood in this same church, watching helplessly as they lowered his wife Callista's casket into the ground. She had dedicated her life to helping others, traveling to war-torn countries, building schools, saving lives, only to die in a senseless accident on her way home from the airport. "Mysterious ways," Father Lazarus Ambrose had said at the funeral, his deep voice resonating with what Kieran now saw as hollow comfort. God has a plan for all of us. But Kieran had found something in his research that night, something that changed everything. Through his university observatory, he had documented strange light phenomena that the locals called heaven's tears. For years, these unexplainable lights had been considered divine signs, bringing pilgrims to Mist Harbor from across the country. But last night, after weeks of sleepless research following Callista's death, Kieran had finally cracked the code. The lights weren't divine at all. They were simply atmospheric anomalies caused by unique geological formations beneath the harbor. Science, cold and clear, explaining away another miracle. The discovery had broken something inside him, shattered what remained of his faith. The heavy wooden doors of the cathedral loomed before him now, their ancient oak panels carved with scenes of divine intervention. Kieran's grip tightened on his briefcase. Inside the church, he could hear the congregation singing hymns, the same hymns Callista had loved, her voice always rising above the others with unwavering faith. Through the stained glass windows, distorted by the ever-present fog, Kieran caught glimpses of the assembled faithful. Father Lazarus stood at the altar, his ceremonial robes catching the light that filtered through the rose window above. Senna Whitehaven sat in her usual place near the front, her bookstore closed on Sundays despite the tourists, her own past trauma somehow transformed into unshakable belief. Kieran's hand rested on the door handle, cold metal biting into his palm. The rage that had been building since Callista's death, amplified by his discovery, finally boiled over. With a strength born of grief and desperation, he threw the doors open. The sound echoed like thunder through the cathedral, causing the congregation to turn in unison. Father Lazarus stopped mid-sentence, his eyes widening as he recognized Kieran. But this wasn't the mild-mannered professor who had once taught Sunday school. This was someone else entirely. "God is dead!" Kieran's voice shattered the sacred silence, bouncing off ancient stones and making the candles flicker. "And I can prove it." He strode down the central aisle, pulling papers from his briefcase, charts, graphs, scientific evidence that would tear down their comfortable illusions. But as he reached the altar, something strange began to happen. The fog outside, which had been a constant presence in Mist Harbor for generations, started to glow with an intensity that no one had ever seen before. Through the stained glass windows, heaven's tears began to fall. Not the usual subtle lights that tourists came to photograph, but brilliant streams of luminescence that defied Kieran's carefully constructed explanations. The papers in his hands trembled, not from his own shaking now, but from something else. Something that would force him to question everything he thought he had figured out. And that was just the beginning of what would become the most extraordinary day in Mist Harbor's history. The Cathedral of the Sacred Light had never felt more silent than in the moments following Kieran's outburst. The brilliant streams of light filtering through the stained glass seemed to intensify, casting otherworldly patterns across the stone floor. His scientific papers, still clutched in trembling hands, cast dancing shadows that seemed to mock his certainty. Father Lazarus Ambrose stood motionless at the altar, his weathered face a mask of concern rather than the anger Kieran had expected. The priest's eyes, deep and knowing, held something that made Kieran's scientific resolve waver, not fear or judgment, but a profound understanding that seemed to pierce through his armor of grief and rage. "My son," Father Lazarus began, his voice carrying an unusual timbre that seemed to resonate with the very stones of the cathedral. "What have you found that brings such certainty to your heart?" Kieran's laugh was bitter, echoing harshly through the sacred space. He thrust his research forward, graphs and calculations spilling across the altar. "Your heaven's tears. Nothing but ionized particles interacting with the geological formations beneath the harbor. I've tracked them, measured them, explained them. These miracles you've built your faith upon are nothing but scientific phenomena." The congregation stirred uneasily, whispers rippling through the pews. Among them, Senna Whitehaven rose slowly from her seat, her presence commanding attention. The former war correspondent had seen enough conflict to recognize the battle raging within Kieran, not between science and faith, but between grief and acceptance. "When I was in Damascus," Senna's voice carried clearly through the cathedral, "I saw things that defied explanation. Science couldn't account for why some lived while others died. Data couldn't explain the moments of inexplicable grace I witnessed in the midst of chaos." But Kieran wasn't ready to listen. He turned back to the altar, his voice rising. "Grace? Where was grace when Callista died? She spent her life helping others, believing in your God, and what did it get her? A senseless death on a foggy road." As if in response to his words, the mysterious lights outside intensified further. The fog that perpetually shrouded Mist Harbor began to swirl in unusual patterns, visible through the cathedral's windows. Several members of the congregation gasped as the lights seemed to pulse in rhythm with Kieran's words. Brother Ezra Vale, the elderly caretaker who had tended the cathedral for over 5 decades, stepped forward from his corner. His gnarled hands gripped his wooden cane as he approached Kieran. "I've watched these lights for 50 years, Professor Thorne. I've seen them respond to joy, to sorrow, to faith, and yes, even to doubt, but I've never seen them act like this." Kieran turned to face the old caretaker, ready to dismiss his observations as superstition, but the words died in his throat. Through the rose window above the altar, a singular beam of light had broken through the fog, illuminating his scattered papers. The mathematical equations and careful observations he'd documented seemed to shift before his eyes, the patterns rearranging themselves in ways that defied his understanding. "Impossible," he whispered, reaching for the papers with trembling hands. The calculations were the same, but somehow they seemed to point to a different conclusion, one he couldn't quite grasp. Father Lazarus stepped down from the altar, his movements deliberate and calm. "Science and faith need not be enemies, Kieran. Your wife understood this. Callista used to tell me how she saw God's hand in the precise mathematical patterns of the universe, in the very laws of physics you study." The mention of Callista's name sent a fresh wave of pain through Kieran's chest. He remembered their late-night discussions, how she would smile at his scientific explanations but always find something deeper, something beyond the numbers. She was wrong, he insisted, but his voice lacked its earlier conviction. Senna had made her way to the front of the church now, standing near enough that Kieran could see the faint scar on her cheek, a reminder of her time documenting conflicts around the world. "When you lose someone," she said softly, "it's natural to want explanations, to seek concrete answers. But some things can't be contained in formulas, Kieran. Some things are bigger than our understanding." The lights outside continued their strange dance, and for a moment Kieran thought he saw patterns in them that his research hadn't accounted for. The fog seemed to press against the windows, not with its usual opacity but with an almost luminous quality that defied his scientific instruments' measurements. As he stood there, surrounded by the faithful yet feeling utterly alone, Kieran felt something shift in the atmosphere. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The air itself seemed charged with an energy he couldn't explain, and for the first time since Callista's death, his certainty wavered. The neat, orderly world of scientific explanation he'd clung to began to show cracks, like fissures in a foundation he thought unshakable. Brother Ezra's voice cut through his thoughts, gentle but firm. Sometimes, Professor, the most profound discoveries come not from proving what we know, but from acknowledging what we don't. The cathedral fell silent again, but it was a different kind of silence now. Not the shocked hush that had followed his outburst, but something deeper, more contemplative. The lights of heaven's tears continued their mysterious dance outside, and Kieran found himself unable to look away from their inexplicable patterns. He didn't notice Father Lazarus approaching until the priest's hand rested gently on his shoulder. "Stay," the priest said simply. "Watch. There may be more to your research than you've allowed yourself to see." And as the fog continued to swirl outside the cathedral windows, Kieran Thorne, the man who had come to destroy faith with science, found himself standing at the edge of a mystery that his calculations couldn't explain, a mystery that was only beginning to unfold. As the morning light continued to filter through the stained glass windows, casting prismatic shadows across the cathedral floor, Kieran felt the weight of every eye in the congregation upon him. His briefcase, now empty of its damning evidence, lay forgotten at his feet, while his research papers remained scattered across the altar like fallen autumn leaves. The mysterious lights known as Heaven's Tears continued their unusual display outside, their intensity unprecedented in Mist Harbor's long history. Through the windows, the fog had taken on an almost crystalline quality, refracting light in ways that seemed to defy the very physics Kieran had devoted his life to studying. Astrid Novak, the local artist known for her haunting paintings of the Heaven's Tears phenomenon, had been sketching frantically in her notebook since Kieran's dramatic entrance. Her charcoal moved across the page with an almost fevered intensity, capturing something in the lights that others might have missed. She stood up suddenly, her voice cutting through the tense silence. "Professor Thorne," she called out, her accent still carrying traces of her Eastern European homeland. "These patterns, they're different from anything I've documented before. Look at how they're moving. It's almost like they're responding to your presence." Kieran turned sharply toward her, ready to dismiss her observation as artistic fancy, but the words died in his throat. The lights were indeed moving in unusual patterns, creating configurations that his research had never predicted. His scientific mind raced to explain it, but each theory crumbled as quickly as it formed. Father Lazarus moved to stand beside him, his ceremonial robes rustling softly against the stone floor. "You know, Kieran, before I entered the priesthood, I worked in quantum physics. The deeper I delved into the mysteries of the universe, the more I realized how little we truly understand." This revelation caught Kieran off guard. He turned to face the priest, seeing him in a new light. "You were a physicist? Why would you abandon science for—" He gestured vaguely at the cathedral around them. A knowing smile crossed Father Lazarus's weathered face. "Who says I abandoned it? The more I studied the fundamental forces that govern our universe, the more I saw the fingerprints of something greater. Science doesn't disprove God, Kieran. It reveals the elegance of creation." Before Kieran could respond, Rowan Blackthorne, the town's respected elder, stepped forward from his place in the front pew. His voice, though softened by age, carried the weight of decades of wisdom. "I remember when your wife first came to Mist Harbor, Professor. She saw no conflict between her faith and your scientific work. In fact, she used to say that your research into Heaven's Tears only strengthened her belief in the divine." The mention of Callista's perspective struck Kieran like a physical blow. He remembered their late-night discussions, how she would listen intently to his theories about the lights, then gently suggest that perhaps there was room for both scientific explanation and divine wonder. He had always admired her ability to hold both views simultaneously, even if he hadn't shared it. Senna Whitehaven approached slowly, her footsteps echoing in the vast space. When I was covering conflicts around the world, I saw both the worst and the best of humanity. Science could explain the trajectory of bullets and the impact of explosions, but it couldn't explain why some people would risk everything to help strangers, or how hope could survive in the darkest places. The lights outside suddenly intensified, sending brilliant beams through the rose window above the altar. The scattered papers of Kieran's research were illuminated in an almost supernatural glow, and for a moment, he thought he saw patterns in his data that he had somehow missed before. Brother Ezra's voice came from behind him, soft but clear. "The lights have always been strongest when someone is at a crossroads, Professor. In 50 years, I've seen them guide many lost souls home." Kieran wanted to argue, to point out the logical fallacies in their statements, but something held him back. Perhaps it was the way the lights moved outside, defying his carefully documented patterns. Perhaps it was the memory of Callista's unwavering belief in something beyond the measurable, the quantifiable. Father Lazarus picked up one of the scattered papers from the altar, studying the complex equations written there. "Your calculations are impressive, Kieran. But have you considered that explaining how something works doesn't diminish its wonder? That understanding the mechanics of a miracle doesn't make it any less miraculous?" As if in response to the priest's words, the fog outside began to shift and swirl in new patterns. Through the windows, the lights of heaven's tiers created configurations that seemed to mirror the mathematical formulas scattered across the altar, but with variations that Kieran's research hadn't predicted. Astrid held up her sketch, showing how she had captured the current light pattern. "Look," she said, her artist's eye catching what others might miss. "The lights are forming the same golden ratio we see throughout nature. The very mathematics you use to disprove divinity are being reflected back at you." Kieran found himself drawn to the windows, his scientific mind struggling to reconcile what he was seeing with what he thought he had proven. The fog outside pressed against the glass like a living thing, the lights within it pulsing with an almost intelligent rhythm. For the first time since Callista's death, he felt his certainty waver. The neat, ordered world of pure scientific explanation he had clung to began to feel insufficient to explain what he was witnessing. And yet, his research wasn't wrong. The mathematical patterns were there. The physical principles held true. But perhaps, just perhaps, they were part of something larger than he had allowed himself to consider. As the cathedral fell into contemplative silence, the lights of heaven's tiers continued their mysterious dance outside. Kieran Thorne, the man who had come to denounce faith with science, found himself standing at the intersection of the explainable and the mysterious, feeling the first cracks appear in the walls he had built around his grief-stricken heart. The cathedral's ancient stones seemed to pulse with an energy that matched the rhythmic patterns of heaven's tiers outside. Kieran found himself drawn to one of the tall windows, his trained observer's eye noting details he had somehow missed in all his years of research. The fog wasn't just moving, it was orchestrating itself into complex geometric patterns that both confirmed and contradicted his scientific findings. As he stood transfixed by the display, Senna Whitehaven approached quietly, her presence bringing with it the weight of someone who had seen both miracles and horrors. "You know," she began, her voice carrying the measured tone of a seasoned journalist, "when I was in Sarajevo, I witnessed something that changed my entire perspective on what's possible." Kieran turned slightly, his scientific curiosity piqued despite his skepticism. Senna continued, her eyes focused on the swirling mists outside. "There was a hospital, caught in the crossfire. Every scientific prediction, every tactical analysis said it should have been destroyed. But somehow, inexplicably, every shell that should have hit it went wide. The doctors there called it divine intervention. The military called it statistical anomaly. Both were right, and both were wrong." Father Lazarus, who had been examining Kieran's scattered research papers, looked up with interest. "When I worked at CERN," he added, surprising Kieran again with his scientific background, "we often found that the more precisely we measured things, the more mysterious they became. Quantum entanglement, wave-particle duality, science itself keeps revealing layers of reality that defy our traditional understanding." The lights outside suddenly intensified, causing several members of the congregation to gasp. Astrid Novak's charcoal moved frantically across her paper, trying to capture the unprecedented patterns. "Professor," she called out, "these formations. They're matching the Fibonacci sequence perfectly, but with variations I've never seen before." Brother Ezra hobbled closer to the window, his aged eyes squinting at the display. "In all my years tending this cathedral, I've never seen them react like this. It's as if they're trying to speak to us, or perhaps to you, Professor Thorne." Kieran wanted to dismiss their observations as mere coincidence or pattern-seeking behavior, a common human fallacy he had often lectured about. But his own scientific training forced him to acknowledge that something extraordinary was occurring. The lights were behaving in ways that his research hadn't predicted, following patterns that somehow merged mathematical precision with inexplicable variations. Rowan Blackthorne's deep voice cut through his thoughts. "Your wife once told me something interesting about your research, Professor. She said that every time you discovered a new pattern in the lights, you would get this look of wonder on your face. The same look she saw in people when they experienced a moment of deep spiritual connection." The mention of Callista's observation struck something deep within Kieran. He remembered those moments clearly, the pure joy of scientific discovery, the feeling that he was touching something profound and beautiful. Had there been something more to those feelings than just intellectual satisfaction? Suddenly, a new pattern emerged in the lights outside, one that made Kieran's blood run cold. The swirling mists had formed into a perfect mathematical representation of the last equation he and Callista had discussed together, the night before her accident. It was a formula they had disagreed about, he seeing it as proof of natural law, she seeing it as evidence of divine design. "That's impossible," he whispered, his voice trembling. "Those equations were never published. They were only in my private notes." Father Lazarus stepped closer, his eyes moving between the lights and Kieran's face. "Perhaps, my son, there are truths that exist beyond our ability to publish or prove them. Your wife understood this, that truth can be both measurable and mysterious." The air in the cathedral seemed to grow thicker, charged with an energy that made the hair on the back of Kieran's neck stand up. The lights outside continued their impossible display, now forming patterns that seemed to bridge the gap between his scientific equations and something else. Something that defied his instruments but not his perception. Senna moved to stand beside him, her reporter's instincts sensing a crucial moment. "Sometimes," she said softly, "the most important discoveries come not from proving what we believe, but from being willing to question it. Isn't that the true heart of scientific inquiry?" The question hit Kieran with unexpected force. Throughout his career, he had prided himself on his commitment to scientific skepticism, to questioning everything. But had he actually been selectively skeptical, questioning only those things that challenged his predetermined worldview? As if responding to his internal struggle, the heavens' tears began to pulse with a new rhythm. Through the windows, Kieran could see the fog parting in ways that seemed to defy fluid dynamics, creating patterns that simultaneously supported and transcended his scientific understanding. Brother Ezra's voice came soft but clear. "The lights have always shown us what we need to see, Professor. Not always what we want to see, but what our hearts need to understand." Kieran found himself facing a crisis more profound than his original angry certainty. The evidence before him refused to fit neatly into either pure scientific explanation or simple faith. It demanded something more complex, a perspective that could encompass both the mathematical precision he had documented and the inexplicable variations he was witnessing. The cathedral fell into a deep silence, broken only by the soft scratch of Astrid's charcoal as she continued to document the unprecedented display. The lights outside seemed to wait, their patterns holding steady in a configuration that merged scientific precision with something more, something that hinted at depths beyond either faith or reason alone. And in that moment, Kieran Thorne began to understand that perhaps the real question wasn't whether God was dead, but whether his own understanding of what was possible had been too limited, too rigid, to encompass the full complexity of existence. The morning light had shifted now, casting longer shadows through the cathedral's stained glass windows. The heavens' tiers continued their extraordinary display outside, but their patterns had taken on a new quality, one that seemed to weave together the mathematical and the mysterious in ways that challenged everything Kieran thought he understood. Astrid Novak had filled several pages of her sketchbook, each drawing capturing a different aspect of the phenomenon. She approached Kieran, spreading the pages across a nearby pew. "Look at this progression," she said, her artist's hands tracing the patterns she had documented. "It's as if the lights are having a conversation with your equations." Indeed, looking at the sequence of sketches, Kieran could see how the lights had moved from mimicking his basic research formulas to creating variations that suggested something more. Each pattern built upon the last, like a complex mathematical proof leading to an unexpected conclusion. Father Lazarus knelt down to examine the drawings, his scientific background evident in the way he analyzed the patterns. "When I was at CERN," he said thoughtfully, "we often found that the most profound discoveries came when our instruments detected something that shouldn't have been possible according to our existing models. As if on cue, the lights outside shifted again, forming a pattern that Kieran recognized from his late-night research sessions, but with a crucial difference. Where his equations predicted symmetry, the lights showed beautiful imperfections that somehow made the whole pattern more complete, more alive." Senna Whitehaven stepped forward, her journalist's instincts drawing her to this unfolding story. "In my years covering conflicts, I learned that truth often lies in the spaces between what we can prove and what we can perceive. Sometimes the most important part of a story is what can't be captured in words or data." Brother Ezra, who had been quietly observing from his corner, suddenly spoke up. 50 years ago, when I first became caretaker here, a scientist much like yourself came to study the lights. He had all manner of instruments and theories. But in the end, do you know what he discovered?" Kieran turned to the old man, curiosity overcoming his skepticism. "What?" "That his instruments could measure the lights, but not their impact. They could document the patterns, but not their meaning. He spent the rest of his life here studying both the mathematics and the mystery." Brother Ezra's eyes twinkled. "He was my father." This revelation sent a shockwave through Kieran. He had read papers from that period, groundbreaking work that had laid the foundation for his own research. "Your father was Daniel Vale?" His equations on atmospheric light phenomena were revolutionary. Brother Ezra nodded, leaning on his cane. "And yet he chose to remain here, tending this cathedral, watching the lights. He used to say that understanding how something works doesn't diminish its wonder, it deepens it." The lights outside pulsed again, and this time Kieran noticed something he had missed before. The patterns weren't just mathematical, they were responsive. They seemed to react to the conversations, the emotions, the very thoughts filling the cathedral. Rowan Blackthorne, who had been silently watching, spoke up. "Your wife understood this, Professor. Callista would often sit here for hours watching the lights. She said they helped her see how your scientific work and her faith were two parts of the same truth." Kieran felt a tightness in his chest at the memory. Callista had tried to tell him this many times, but he had always dismissed it as her way of reconciling their different worldviews. Now, watching the lights move in patterns that both confirmed and transcended his research, he wondered if she had seen something he had been too certain to perceive. Father Lazarus picked up one of Kieran's scattered research papers, studying it intently. "These equations are beautiful," he said. "They describe the mechanics of the lights perfectly, but perhaps they're like sheet music. They can tell you the notes, but not the full experience of the symphony." As if responding to his words, the heavens' tiers began to move in a new way, creating patterns that reminded Kieran of music made visible. Mathematical in structure but alive with something more. He watched as the fog swirled and shifted, forming shapes that seemed to dance between the realms of physics and poetry. Astrid had started a new sketch, her charcoal moving urgently across the paper. "The patterns," she murmured. "They're telling a story. Not just about light and atmosphere, but about connection, between the measurable and the mysterious, between loss and hope." Kieran found himself drawn to her sketches again, seeing them now with new eyes. The progression she had captured showed more than just the light's movements. It revealed a kind of dialogue between the rational and the transcendent, each pattern building on the last to create something greater than either alone. The cathedral had grown quiet again, but it was a different kind of silence. Not the tense hush that had followed his initial outburst, but something deeper, more contemplative. The light streaming through the windows painted everything in subtle shades of possibility, suggesting that perhaps the boundaries between faith and reason were more permeable than he had imagined. Brother Ezra shuffled closer to Kieran, his aged hand reaching out to touch the scattered research papers. "My father spent his life studying these lights," he said softly. "In the end, he concluded that their true miracle wasn't in their existence, but in their ability to help us see beyond our own limitations." As the morning continued to unfold, Kieran Thorne stood in the cathedral his wife had loved, surrounded by people who had known her, watching lights that defied simple explanation. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, he began to feel something shift within him. Not a surrender of his scientific understanding, but an expansion of it, making room for something more. The cathedral bells tolled noon, their deep resonance mixing with the otherworldly display of heaven's tears outside. Kieran found himself drawn to the spot where he and Callista had often sat together during services, the third pew from the front, where the morning light would catch the rose window just so, creating patterns she had loved to trace with her finger. Father Lazarus, sensing the weight of memory settling over Kieran, approached quietly. "You know," he began, his voice gentle, "Callista once spoke to me about your first discovery of the mathematical patterns in the lights. She said she had never seen you more alive than when you realized there was an underlying order to what everyone else saw as chaos." The memory struck Kieran with unexpected force. He remembered that night clearly, the excitement of finding the first clear pattern in his data, rushing home to share it with Callista. She had listened intently, her eyes shining with pride and something else, a deeper understanding he hadn't fully appreciated at the time. "She told me," Senna added, moving closer, "that your greatest gift as a scientist wasn't just your brilliance with equations, but your ability to see beauty in patterns others missed. She believed that same gift would eventually lead you to see the patterns that existed beyond the mathematical." As if responding to these memories, the heavens' tiers outside began to shift again, forming configurations that seemed to echo the very patterns Kieran had discovered that night years ago. But now they were different, more complex, more alive, as if the basic mathematical framework he had discovered was just the foundation for something far more profound. Astrid's charcoal moved swiftly across a new page, capturing the evolving display. "Look at how the lights are layering," she observed, her artist's eye catching subtle nuances. "It's like they're building on your original discoveries, showing you the next level of complexity." Brother Ezra hobbled forward, his aged hands trembling slightly as he reached for one of Kieran's research papers. "My father's last journal entry," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "spoke of moments like this. He wrote that sometimes the lights reveal themselves in stages, like a student ready to learn deeper truths only when they've mastered the basics." Rowan Blackthorne, who had been quietly observing, stepped forward. The town records speak of similar occurrences throughout Mist Harbor's history. Moments when the lights seemed to respond to those seeking answers, showing them what they needed to see rather than what they expected to find. Kieran watched as the patterns outside continued to evolve, each transformation both supporting and transcending his scientific understanding. The fog that perpetually shrouded Mist Harbor had taken on an almost crystalline quality, refracting light in ways that created multiple layers of interaction. Physical phenomena that his equations could explain, overlaid with variations that defied conventional analysis. Father Lazarus studied the display with both scientific curiosity and spiritual wonder. "In quantum physics," he mused, "we learned that the act of observation affects the outcome of experiments. Perhaps these lights are showing us something similar, that our approach to understanding them influences what they reveal to us." "When I was in the field," Senna added, her reporter's instincts drawing connections, I learned that sometimes the most important story isn't the one you set out to tell, but the one that reveals itself when you're ready to see it. The lights outside pulsed again, and this time Kieran noticed something he had somehow missed in all his years of research. The patterns weren't just mathematical constructs. They were responsive, interactive, almost conscious. They seemed to be engaging with the very questions being asked in the cathedral, creating configurations that bridged the gap between scientific inquiry and spiritual seeking. Astrid held up her latest sketch, showing how the current pattern incorporated elements from all her previous drawings. "It's like watching a conversation unfold," she said softly. "Each pattern builds on what came before, creating something new while honoring what was already there." Brother Ezra's voice carried the weight of decades of observation. The lights have always been teachers for those willing to learn. They show us what we're ready to see, when we're ready to see it. As the morning light continued to filter through the stained glass, Kieran found himself confronting questions he had never allowed himself to ask. What if his scientific discoveries, rather than disproving the existence of something greater, were actually revealing layers of complexity he hadn't been ready to perceive? What if Callista's ability to see both the mathematical precision and the spiritual significance of the lights wasn't a contradiction, but a more complete understanding? The heavens' tiers outside seemed to respond to these internal questions, creating patterns that somehow expressed both mathematical certainty and infinite possibility. Each configuration contained elements that his equations could predict, nested within variations that suggested something more, something that existed in the space between provable fact and perceivable truth. "Your wife," Father Lazarus said quietly, "never saw your work as a challenge to her faith. She saw it as a window into understanding how the divine might express itself through natural law. Perhaps that's what these lights are showing us now, that the question isn't whether God is dead, but whether our ways of looking for God have been too limited." As these words settled in the cathedral's sacred space, Kieran Thorne found himself standing at a crossroads. The angry certainty that had driven him to burst through these doors was being transformed, not into doubt, but into something more complex. A recognition that perhaps the truth he sought was larger than either pure science or simple faith could fully contain. The afternoon light had begun to shift, casting new shadows through the cathedral windows as heaven's tiers continued their unprecedented display. Inside, the atmosphere had transformed from the tense confrontation of earlier to something more contemplative, more profound. Kieran stood near the altar, watching as Astrid's latest sketches captured the evolving patterns of light with an artist's intuition for deeper meaning. Suddenly, something caught his attention, a detail in the lights he had never noticed before. Within the complex mathematical patterns, there appeared to be a secondary structure, one that seemed to mirror the very algorithms he had developed to study them. But there was something more, something that made his scientific mind race with new possibilities. "Father Lazarus," he called out, his voice carrying a note of urgency. "Look at this formation. It's implementing a self-modifying algorithm, something I theorized but could never prove was possible in natural phenomena." The priest moved closer, his scientific background evident in the way he analyzed the pattern. "Remarkable," he muttered, adjusting his glasses. "It's as if the lights are demonstrating not just the patterns you discovered, but the next logical evolution of your work." Senna Whitehaven, who had been documenting everything in her reporter's notebook, looked up sharply. "Like they're teaching you?" she suggested, her journalistic instincts sensing something significant. "Showing you what comes next?" Brother Ezra's weathered voice added to the conversation. "My father's journals spoke of something similar. He believed the lights possessed a kind of intelligence, not consciousness as we understand it, but a purpose, an ability to reveal truths to those ready to receive them." The congregation had thinned somewhat over the hours, but those who remained watched with rapt attention as Kieran moved from window to window, his trained observer's eye catching details he had somehow missed in years of research. Each new observation seemed to build on the last, creating a framework of understanding that both challenged and expanded his scientific worldview. Astrid held up a series of sketches, arranging them in chronological order. "Look at the progression," she said, her accent thickening with excitement. "Each pattern contains elements of the previous one, but evolved more complex. It's like watching a language develop in real time." Rowan Blackthorne stepped forward, his elderly frame carrying the dignity of Mist Harbor's historian. "There are accounts in our town records of similar events, moments when the light seemed to be responding to human understanding, showing more of themselves as people became ready to perceive more." As if in response to these observations, the heavens' tiers outside began to move in new ways, creating configurations that seemed to exist at the intersection of multiple mathematical principles. Kieran watched, fascinated, as the patterns demonstrated properties he had only theorized about in his most speculative research he had abandoned as too improbable. "Callista tried to tell me about this," he said softly, more to himself than the others. "She would say that the lights seemed different each time she looked at them, as if they were growing along with our understanding. I always dismissed it as poetic thinking. But now..." Father Lazarus placed a gentle hand on Kieran's shoulder. "In quantum physics, we learned that the perspective of the observer affects the behavior of the observed. Perhaps these lights are showing us something similar on a macro scale, that our capacity to understand influences what they're able to reveal." The fog outside had taken on an almost crystalline quality, creating prismatic effects that sent rainbow-like projections dancing across the cathedral's ancient stones. But unlike ordinary atmospheric phenomena, these displays seemed to follow patterns that suggested purpose rather than random diffraction. "When I was covering the war," Senna said thoughtfully, "I learned that truth often reveals itself in layers. What looks like one thing from a distance shows its true complexity only when you're ready to look deeper." Kieran found himself drawn back to his scattered research papers, seeing them now with new eyes. The equations were still valid, the mathematical foundations still solid, but now he could see how they might be pointing to something larger, something more profound than he had initially understood. Brother Ezra shuffled forward, leaning heavily on his cane. "The lights have always been here, Professor Thorne, showing us what we need to see. Sometimes that's scientific truth, sometimes spiritual comfort. Often, it's both." The cathedral had grown quieter as the afternoon deepened, but the quality of the silence had changed. It was no longer the tense hush of confrontation, but something more contemplative, a shared witnessing of something extraordinary. Astrid's charcoal moved across yet another page, capturing the latest evolution of the light's display. "They're showing us something new now," she said, her artist's sensitivity picking up subtle changes. "Look at how the patterns are beginning to fold in on themselves, creating layers within layers." Indeed, the heavens' tiers had begun to demonstrate properties that seemed to transcend traditional physics, while simultaneously adhering to fundamental mathematical principles. It was as if they were showing Kieran a bridge between the quantifiable and the mysterious, between the provable and the perceivable. "You know," Father Lazarus said thoughtfully, "your wife once told me something interesting about your work. She said that every time you made a new discovery about the lights, you came closer to understanding what she had always felt about them, that they were both natural and supernatural, both explainable and mysterious." As these words settled in the sacred space, Kieran felt something shift within him. The angry certainty that had driven him to burst through the cathedral doors was being transformed, not into doubt, but into something more nuanced, a recognition that perhaps the truth he sought was large enough to encompass both his scientific understanding and something more. The afternoon had deepened into early evening, the changing light creating new dimensions in the heavens' tiers display. The remaining congregation members had formed small groups throughout the cathedral, speaking in hushed tones as they witnessed the unprecedented phenomena. Kieran found himself at the center of it all, his scientific mind racing to process what he was observing. The fog outside had begun to move in ways that defied his previous understanding of atmospheric physics. Through the cathedral windows, the lights created intricate patterns that seemed to respond not just to physical laws, but to the very thoughts and emotions filling the sacred space. "Professor Thorne," Astrid called out, her voice carrying a note of urgency. "Something's changing in the pattern structure. Look at this." She held up her latest series of sketches, laying them out in sequence on a nearby pew. The progression was striking. Each drawing showed an increasing complexity that somehow maintained mathematical elegance while incorporating elements that seemed almost intentional. Father Lazarus moved closer, his scientific background evident in his careful analysis. "The base patterns still follow your equations," he observed, "but these variations, they're not random deviations. They appear to be building towards something." Senna Whitehaven had been documenting everything with a reporter's precision. "It reminds me of something I saw in Tibet," she said, her voice thoughtful. "Monks spending days creating intricate sand mandalas, patterns within patterns, each layer revealing new meanings while maintaining perfect mathematical symmetry." Brother Ezra approached slowly, his aged hands trembling slightly as he reached for one of Astrid's sketches. "My father's final journal entry," he said, his voice carrying the weight of memory, described something similar. He wrote about moments when the light seemed to be reaching out, trying to bridge the gap between human understanding and divine mystery. The fog outside swirled more intensely now, creating formations that seemed to pulse with an inner light. Kieran watched as the patterns evolved, each transformation both supporting and transcending his scientific theories. The equations he had developed were still valid, but they now appeared to be just the foundation for something far more complex. "When I worked at CERN," Father Lazarus said quietly, "we often found that our most significant discoveries came not from proving our theories right, but from recognizing when reality was showing us something beyond our current understanding." Rowan Blackthorne stepped forward, his historian's perspective adding another layer to the unfolding events. "There are records in our town archives," he began, "of similar occurrences throughout Mist Harbor's history. Moments when the lights seemed to respond to human presence, particularly during times of profound questioning or spiritual crisis." As if in response to his words, the heavens' tiers began to form new configurations that seemed to interact with the very air inside the cathedral. The temperature fluctuated subtly, and the acoustic properties of the space seemed to shift, creating areas where sound behaved in unusual ways. "The physics of this is fascinating," Kieran muttered, his scientific mind engaging despite his earlier skepticism. "These patterns are demonstrating properties I've only theorized about in my most speculative research. The way they're interacting with both light and sound waves." Senna moved closer, her journalist's instincts sensing the significance of the moment. "Could it be," she suggested carefully, "that your research was actually leading you toward this understanding all along? That your scientific pursuit was bringing you closer to, rather than further from, the deeper truth?" The question hung in the air as the lights outside continued their extraordinary display. Kieran found himself remembering conversations with Callista, moments when she had tried to show him how his work might be revealing something greater than pure scientific principle. "Your wife understood this," Brother Ezra said softly, as if reading his thoughts. "She would sit here for hours watching the lights, seeing in them both the mathematical precision you had discovered and something more, something that existed in the space between provable fact and felt truth." Astrid had begun a new sketch, her charcoal moving with urgent purpose across the paper. "The patterns are changing again," she announced, her artist's sensitivity catching subtle shifts that others might miss. "They're becoming more integrated, as if different aspects of their nature are no longer separate but harmonizing." Indeed, the heavens' tiers had begun to demonstrate properties that seemed to unite various physical phenomena: light, sound, temperature, even the electromagnetic field that Kieran's instruments had detected in his research. But they did so in ways that both confirmed and transcended known scientific principles. "In quantum mechanics," Father Lazarus observed, "we learned that some particles can exist in multiple states simultaneously. Perhaps these lights are showing us something similar on a macro scale, a phenomenon that can be both scientifically explicable and spiritually significant." As the evening light continued to shift, casting new shadows through the cathedral's ancient stones, Kieran found himself standing at the intersection of everything he had believed and everything he had denied. The angry certainty that had driven him to burst through these doors was being transformed into something more nuanced, more complex. A recognition that perhaps the universe was large enough to encompass both his scientific understanding and something greater. The cathedral's evening shadows lengthened as heaven's tiers continued their unprecedented display, their intensity undiminished despite the fading daylight. Kieran stood before the great rose window, his research papers clutched loosely in one hand, while the other traced patterns in the air, following the light's mysterious movements. The remaining congregation members had fallen into a reverent silence, broken only by the soft scratch of Astrid's charcoal and the occasional whispered observation. The atmosphere had transformed entirely from the charged confrontation of the morning into something more profound, a shared witnessing of something that defied simple explanation. "Professor?" Astrid called softly, her voice carrying in the hushed space. "I've been comparing these patterns to my previous studies of the lights. Look at this." She spread out months' worth of sketches alongside her recent drawings. "They've never shown this level of complexity before. My father spent his final years trying to understand something similar. His equations could explain the mechanics of the lights, but not their apparent ability to interact with human consciousness. He called it the bridge between measurable and meaningful. The fog outside had taken on new properties now, creating layers of interaction that seemed to defy conventional physics while simultaneously adhering to mathematical principles. Kieran watched as the patterns evolved, each transformation adding new depth to his understanding. "It's remarkable," he said softly, more to himself than the others. "The basic frameworks I discovered are still valid, but they're being expressed in ways I never imagined possible. It's as if..." He paused, struggling to find the right words. "It's as if the lights are showing us how scientific truth and spiritual experience might be different perspectives on the same reality." Rowan Blackthorne nodded slowly, his historian's knowledge adding context to the moment. "There are accounts in our archives of similar events, times when the lights seemed to act as a bridge between different ways of understanding. The fishermen used them for navigation, the scientists studied their patterns, and the spiritual seekers found meaning in their movements. Each group saw something true, but none saw the whole truth." As if responding to these observations, the heavens' tiers began to move in new ways, creating configurations that seemed to exist at the intersection of multiple natural laws. The temperature in the cathedral fluctuated subtly, and the acoustic properties of the space shifted, creating areas where sound behaved in unexpected ways. Astrid's charcoal moved swiftly across fresh paper, capturing the evolving display. "The patterns are integrating," she observed, her artist's eye catching subtle nuances. "Earlier, they were showing us different aspects separately, the mathematical, the physical, the spiritual, if you will. Now they're showing how these aspects work together." Father Lazarus placed a gentle hand on Kieran's shoulder. "You know, in physics, we learned that light can behave as both a particle and a wave, depending on how we observe it. Perhaps these lights are showing us something similar about truth itself, that it can manifest in different ways without losing its essential nature." The fog outside pressed against the windows now, its crystalline structure creating prismatic effects that sent rainbow-like projections dancing across the cathedral's ancient stones. But unlike ordinary atmospheric phenomena, these displays followed patterns that suggested purpose rather than random diffraction. "When I lost my wife," Senna said quietly, "I thought I had to choose between honoring her memory and moving forward with my life. What I eventually learned was that embracing both was not only possible but necessary. Maybe that's what these lights are showing us about faith and science." Kieran felt something shift within him as he absorbed these words. The anger that had driven him to burst through the cathedral doors that morning seemed distant now, replaced by a growing sense of something larger, a recognition that perhaps his scientific work and Callista's faith had been leading toward the same truth, approached from different directions. Brother Ezra's voice came soft but clear. "Sometimes, Professor, the greatest discoveries come not from proving one perspective right and another wrong, but from finding the larger truth that encompasses both." As the evening deepened around them, the lights of heaven's tiers continued their extraordinary display, weaving patterns that seemed to bridge the gap between the measurable and the mysterious, between what could be proven and what could be perceived. And in that sacred space, Kieran Thorne began to understand that perhaps the question wasn't whether God was dead, but whether his own understanding had been too limited to recognize the full complexity of existence. The first stars had begun to appear in the darkening sky outside the cathedral windows, their distant light mixing with the ever-changing patterns of heaven's tiers. Inside, the atmosphere had transformed into something almost tangible, a shared experience of witnessing something that transcended ordinary understanding. Kieran stood at the altar, where hours earlier he had scattered his research papers in anger. Now he gathered them carefully, seeing in their equations and observations not just scientific data, but stepping stones that had led him to this moment of deeper understanding. "Professor Thorne," Astrid called softly, approaching with her collection of sketches. "I've been mapping the progression of the lights throughout the day. Look at this sequence." She laid out her drawings chronologically, creating a visual timeline of the phenomenon's evolution. The patterns aren't just changing, they're responding to our understanding of them. Father Lazarus leaned in to study the drawings, his scientific background evident in his analytical approach. "Fascinating. It reminds me of a principle we studied in quantum physics, the idea that the very act of observation can influence the behavior of what we're observing. But this," he gestured to the latest sketches, "this suggests something far more complex." Senna Whitehaven had positioned herself near one of the windows, her reporter's notebook filled with observations. "You know," she said thoughtfully, "this reminds me of something I witnessed in northern Tibet. There was a phenomenon the locals called the conscious lights, atmospheric displays that seemed to interact with human intention. Most scientists dismissed it, but those who actually studied it couldn't explain it with conventional physics. The fog outside had begun to move in new ways, creating formations that seemed to pulse with their own inner rhythm. Through the cathedral windows, the lights created patterns that both confirmed and transcended Kieran's scientific theories. Brother Ezra moved closer, his aged hands trembling slightly as he reached out to touch the window glass. "My father's final research," he said softly, "focused on moments like this, when the lights seemed to be reaching across the divide between human understanding and divine mystery. He believed they were showing us something about the nature of reality itself." Rowan Blackthorne, who had been quietly observing, stepped forward. "The town records speak of similar events throughout our history," he noted, his historian's voice carrying the weight of generations. "Moments when the lights appeared to bridge different ways of knowing, scientific observation and spiritual experience coming together in unexpected ways." As if responding to these thoughts, heaven's tiers began to create new configurations that seemed to exist at the intersection of multiple natural laws. The temperature in the cathedral fluctuated subtly, and the acoustic properties of the space shifted, creating areas where sound behaved in unusual ways. "The physics of this is extraordinary," Kieran murmured, his scientific mind fully engaged. "These patterns are demonstrating properties I've only theorized about in my most speculative research, the way they're interacting with both light and sound waves, the electromagnetic variations." Father Lazarus nodded thoughtfully. "When I worked at CERN, we often found that our most significant breakthroughs came not from proving our theories correct, but from recognizing when reality was showing us something beyond our current understanding." Astrid had begun a new sketch, her charcoal moving with urgent purpose. "The patterns are integrating now," she observed, her artist's sensitivity catching subtle changes. "Earlier, they were showing distinct aspects, mathematical, physical, spiritual. Now they're demonstrating how these elements work together." The remaining congregation members watched in reverent silence as the display continued to evolve. The lights outside seemed to pulse with an inner intelligence, creating formations that spoke to both scientific precision and spiritual significance. "You know," Senna said softly, "when I was covering conflicts around the world, I learned that truth often reveals itself in layers. What looks like contradiction from one perspective becomes harmony from another. Brother Ezra's weathered voice added to the conversation. The lights have always been teachers for those willing to learn. They show us what we need to see when we're ready to see it. As the evening deepened, Kieran found himself thinking of Callista, how she had always seen his scientific work not as a challenge to faith, but as another way of understanding the divine. The anger that had driven him to burst through these doors that morning had been transformed into something else, a recognition that perhaps the universe was large enough to encompass both his scientific understanding and something more. "Your wife understood this," Father Lazarus said gently, as if reading his thoughts. "She saw your research as a window into understanding how the divine might express itself through natural law. Perhaps that's what these lights are showing us now, that the question isn't whether God is dead, but whether our ways of looking for God have been too limited." Outside, heaven's tears continued their extraordinary display, weaving patterns that seemed to bridge the gap between the measurable and the mysterious, between what could be proven and what could be perceived. And in that sacred space, surrounded by those who had witnessed his journey from anger to understanding, Kieran Thorne began to grasp something profound about the nature of truth itself. Night had fully descended on Mist Harbor, but the interior of the Cathedral of the Sacred Light remained illuminated by the extraordinary display of heaven's tears. The phenomenon had not diminished with the setting sun. If anything, it had grown more intense, more purposeful in its manifestations. Kieran stood before the great rose window, watching as the lights created patterns that seemed to dance between the realms of science and spirit. His research papers, once weapons in his arsenal against faith, now lay carefully arranged on the altar, their equations telling only part of a larger story. "Professor," Astrid called softly, approaching with her final series of sketches. "I've been thinking about something. These patterns we're seeing, they remind me of music, not just in their mathematical structure, but in the way they speak to something deeper than mere mechanics." Father Lazarus moved closer, his scientific background lending weight to his observations. "In quantum physics, we discovered that particles can exist in harmonic relationships, creating patterns that mirror musical scales. Perhaps what we're seeing is a larger expression of that same principle, the universe expressing itself through multiple layers of meaning." Senna Whitehaven had been contemplating the displays with a journalist's eye for detail. "During my years covering conflicts," she said thoughtfully, "I encountered many moments that defied simple explanation, instances where the line between the physical and the spiritual became remarkably thin. This feels similar." The fog outside had taken on new properties now, its crystalline structure creating effects that both confirmed and transcended known physics. Through the cathedral windows, the lights wove patterns that seemed to respond to the very thoughts and emotions filling the sacred space. Brother Ezra watched from his usual corner, his aged face illuminated by the ethereal display. "My father spent his final years trying to understand the relationship between scientific truth and spiritual experience," he said softly. "He believed they were different languages describing the same reality." As if in response to these reflections, heaven's tears began to move in new ways, creating configurations that seemed to exist at the intersection of multiple natural laws. The temperature in the cathedral fluctuated subtly, and the acoustic properties of the space shifted, creating areas where sound behaved in unexpected ways. "It's remarkable," Kieran murmured, more to himself than the others. "The mathematical foundations are still there, but they're being expressed in ways I never imagined possible. It's as if..." He paused, searching for words. "As if the lights are showing us how different levels of truth can coexist without contradiction." Rowan Blackthorne nodded slowly, his historian's perspective adding depth to the moment. "Our town records speak of similar occurrences throughout Mist Harbor's history, times when the lights seemed to act as a bridge between different ways of understanding. Each observer saw something true, but none saw the complete truth alone." Astrid's charcoal moved across fresh paper, capturing the evolving display. "The patterns have changed since this morning," she observed. "They're no longer just responding to our presence. They're engaging with our understanding, showing us how different perspectives can work together. Father Lazarus placed a gentle hand on Kieran's shoulder. When I was researching particle physics, we learned that the deepest truths often revealed themselves in paradox, wave-particle duality, quantum entanglement. Perhaps these lights are showing us something similar about the nature of reality itself. The remaining congregation members watched in reverent silence as the display continued to evolve. The lights outside seemed to pulse with an inner intelligence, creating formations that spoke to both scientific precision and spiritual significance. "You know," Senna said softly, "in journalism, we're taught to look for objective truth. But over the years, I've learned that sometimes the fullest truth comes from understanding multiple perspectives at once. Maybe that's what's happening here." Brother Ezra's voice carried the weight of decades of observation. The lights have always been teachers for those willing to learn. They show us what we need to see, when we're ready to see it. As the night deepened around them, Kieran found himself thinking of Callista, how she had always seen his scientific work not as a challenge to faith, but as another way of understanding the divine. The anger that had driven him to burst through these doors that morning had been transformed into something else, a recognition that perhaps the universe was large enough to encompass both his scientific understanding and something more. "Your wife understood this," Father Lazarus said gently. "She saw your research as a window into understanding how the divine might express itself through natural law. Perhaps that's what these lights are showing us now, that the question isn't whether God is dead, but whether our ways of looking for God have been too limited." Outside, heaven's tiers continued their extraordinary display, weaving patterns that seemed to bridge the gap between the measurable and the mysterious, between what could be proven and what could be perceived. And in that sacred space, surrounded by those who had witnessed his journey from anger to understanding, Kieran Thorne began to grasp something profound about the nature of truth itself. Midnight approached in Mist Harbor, and the Cathedral of the Sacred Light lived up to its name in ways no one could have predicted when dawn broke that morning. Heaven's tiers continued their extraordinary display, but now with a quieter intensity, as if settling into a new equilibrium between the scientific and the sacred. Kieran Thorne stood at the exact spot where hours earlier he had burst through the doors screaming that God was dead. Now his demeanor was transformed, his face illuminated by the lights that had challenged everything he thought he understood about the universe. "It's interesting," Father Lazarus said softly, joining him at the entrance, "how sometimes we have to reach our darkest point before we can truly see the light. Your scientific mind didn't lead you astray, Kieran. It just needed to expand enough to embrace a larger truth." Astrid approached with her complete collection of the day's sketches, now arranged in a perfect chronological sequence. "Look at the journey," she said, pointing to the progression. "From chaos to order, from conflict to harmony. The lights weren't just changing, they were telling a story." Senna Whitehaven closed her notebook, filled with observations from the extraordinary day. "In all my years as a journalist, I've never seen anything quite like this," she admitted. "Sometimes the most powerful stories are the ones that transform both the subject and the observers." The fog outside had settled into a gentle dance of light and shadow, the mathematical patterns now interweaving with something more subtle, something that spoke to both the mind and the heart. Through the cathedral windows, heaven's tiers created formations that seemed to bridge the gap between what could be measured and what could only be experienced. Brother Ezra watched from his familiar corner, his aged face peaceful. "My father would have loved to see this," he said quietly. He always believed that true understanding would come when science and faith learned to speak each other's language. Rowan Blackthorne, who had remained throughout the long day, stepped forward. "This will become part of our town's history," he said solemnly. "But more importantly, it's become part of our understanding." Kieran picked up one of his research papers from the altar, looking at the equations with new eyes. "The mathematics is still valid," he said thoughtfully. "But now I see it as part of something larger. Callista tried to tell me this, that understanding how something works doesn't diminish its wonder. It deepens it." As if in response to his words, the lights outside shifted into a new configuration, one that seemed to encompass all the patterns they had witnessed throughout the day. The temperature in the cathedral stabilized, and the acoustic anomalies resolved into a harmony that seemed to resonate with the very stones of the building. "You know," Father Lazarus mused, "in quantum physics, we learned that the most fundamental particles exist in states of possibility until they're observed. Perhaps faith and understanding work the same way. They exist in multiple states until we're ready to perceive them fully." Senna nodded thoughtfully. Like the difference between seeing a stained glass window from the outside and seeing it from within when the light shines through it. Both views are true, but together they reveal something more complete. As midnight struck, the bells of the cathedral rang out across Mist Harbor. The heavens' tears responded with a final display of breathtaking beauty, a perfect synthesis of mathematical precision and ineffable grace. In that moment, Kieran understood what Callista had tried to show him, that truth was large enough to encompass both the precision of science and the mysteries of faith. "It's not about choosing between them," he said softly. "It's about learning to see them as different aspects of the same reality." The remaining congregation members began to disperse, each forever changed by what they had witnessed. But they knew that the real miracle wasn't just in the lights themselves. It was in the transformation they had witnessed in one man's journey from darkness to understanding. As Kieran stepped out into the misty night, he felt Callista's presence not as a wound, but as a light within him. He knew now that his scientific work hadn't been leading him away from truth, but toward a larger understanding of it. The lights of heaven's tears continued their eternal dance above Mist Harbor, now not just a phenomenon to be studied, but a bridge between the known and the unknowable. The man who had entered the cathedral screaming that God was dead left it with a profound understanding that truth was far larger than he had imagined, large enough to encompass both the precision of his equations and the mystery of faith that Callista had always seen. And in Mist Harbor, where science and spirit had found a way to speak the same language, the lights continued to fall like tears from heaven, teaching those who were ready to learn that some truths can only be understood when we're willing to see them with both our minds and our hearts. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.